Patrice Arent, Democratic representative in the Utah House from District 36. Thank you so much for being part of Three Questions today.
I'm so glad to be here.
You were first elected in 1996 and have served in both the Utah House and the Senate. As a Democrat Jewish female member of the Utah Legislature, you are in 3 significant minority groups. How has your experience been being a member of all 3 of those groups?
The question is an interesting one because each group is a little different. I'm a Democrat, which means I'm in the minority in terms of passing legislation and the numbers we have to get our bills through. But in Utah, Democrats get bills passed. That's not always true in other states and in our federal system, but I've been able to pass over 80 bills. Now, does that mean everything I want passed? No. Does that mean we spend money all the ways I'd like? No. But I still am able to get a lot done. It's because we work together in a bipartisan way. A few years ago, I founded the Bipartisan Clean Air Caucus, and it's legislators from both sides of the aisle working together. But as a Democrat, we are in the minority, and things have changed. When I first got involved in politics as an intern, we had a Democratic governor, we had a Democratic House, and we had a Democratic Senate in Utah, and that has changed. I think we need balance. I think it's important to have people working together from both sides of the aisle when there's not a supermajority. I can remember a time when we could get the moderate Republicans, I don't know that they exist anymore, but there are a few of them, and the Democrats together, and we could pass legislation or defeat legislation. And now when you have 2/3 of the body controlled by one party, it's a little different.
You have been a lifelong resident of Utah. You moved away, but you came back. Tell me how that has been in terms of, as a Jewish lawmaker, you are with the majority of Latter-day Saint lawmakers.
That's right.
What has that dynamic been like?
You know, in Utah, I think there's a lot of respect for religion and a lot of respect for my religion. People have treated me very well. When we had a horrible tragedy in Pittsburgh, my colleagues came with me to the vigil. When I tell them these are my high holy days, the legislature shouldn't be meeting on these days, and it's not just about me, it's about other Jewish people who might want to come up and listen to hearings or be involved. We don't meet on the Jewish high holy days. So when I was attacked over a religious issue, the governor and Republican and Democratic legislators all came to my defense.
Now, as a woman in the legislature, again, you're in the minority. What has that dynamic been like?
You know, I think people treat me pretty seriously, whether I'm a woman or not. There aren't enough women, and certainly we need to have more, although in the Democratic caucus, women are in control in both the House and the Senate. But, if somebody doesn't vote for one of my bills, maybe to look at the overall picture, is it because I'm a Jewish person, I'm a Democrat, I'm a woman, or they just don't like the concept in the legislation? But I feel like I'm treated well. There are times where people will walk into the room and say, "Hi, Senator so-and-so, hi, Representative so-and-so, hi, Patrice, hi, Senator so-and-so." Now, that's happened more than once. And there certainly are issues. There are issues having to do with problems we've had with lobbyists and others in the past not treating women appropriately. And that's been something that I've been outspoken on.
As a Democratic member of the Utah Legislature, you have pointed out that that does not keep you from passing legislation. For those folks who may not be aware of some of the bills that you have passed, can you give us some of the more significant ones that have made it to the governor's desk and he signed?
I've had over 80 bills that have been signed by the governor, so multiple governors. But one that I'd like to talk about is Utah's baby drop-off law. Years ago, I'd heard the very sad situation of girls getting pregnant and really not even admitting to themselves they were pregnant. And when the baby came, they didn't do what we'd hoped they would do, keep the baby or put it up for a traditional adoption. Instead, the babies ended up in unsafe places like dumpsters. So I looked around at other states, and a few states had passed laws to allow the anonymous drop-off of infants at hospitals. And so I worked on that legislation, and it passed the first year. There were a lot of objections. One group said that girls would get pregnant knowing they could drop their babies at hospitals. And then there was a sunset provision put in the bill, which meant 5 years later we were going to come back and see if this bill really should still be on the books. And now everyone supports it. It's passed in all 50 states in some form. But in Utah, you can drop your baby anonymously at a hospital. and we've saved lives. So that is actually one of my favorite bills that I've ever been able to work on because it makes a difference in people's lives. I do a lot of work in air quality. As I said, I'm the founder and the co-chair of the Clean Air Caucus. It's an important issue to not just people in my district, but people all over the state. It's obviously a major health care issue, but it's also an economic development issue. There are businesses that don't want to come here because of our poor air quality. There are employees that we can't recruit because of air quality. And according to the Envision Utah study, it is the #1 reason why people leave Utah.
That's sad.
It's very sad.
For those of us who stay, we know that the air cleans up eventually.
It does, and we have problems that we can't completely resolve. I mean, you know, if there are wildfires, we can't stop them. But it's a year-round problem, and people don't realize that because we have ozone issues in the summer, too.
Proposition 2, the medical marijuana initiative that came forward, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints came out against that. And yet, it passed.
Oh, yeah.
It passed, or at least it looks like it's going to pass anyway, with the numbers still coming in. But with the LDS Church opposing that proposition and that measure passing, I don't think I've ever seen that happen before, where the church would come out and say, don't vote for this, and it passed. Are we seeing a situation where the church's influence politically in Utah is starting to diminish?
I don't know if it's that, but, you know, I've been knocking on doors for months and months and months, and everybody who brought this up had a story. And they weren't necessarily liberal people I was talking to, but it's some aunt or some cousin or some friend that needed medical marijuana to help them relieve pain. And often they would say to me, it's better than opioids. It's safer than opioids. But everybody had a story. And I just think it was so personal for people. And they really supported it. I've never seen anything like this. You know, we haven't had a lot of initiatives on the ballot in the past. So to say the church's influence, we don't know because this just hasn't happened before. This was a very unique year. But boy, I heard about that more than all of the other initiatives put together.
Now, with the compromise bill that is being drafted and formed between the pro-medical marijuana side and the more conservative legislative side, those who in favor of Proposition 2 had said that its passage was absolutely necessary to ensure that the legislature would actually take action on this issue. Do you feel like Prop 2 had to pass in order to force the legislature's hand, or could it have not passed and the electorate be able to trust the legislature that it would actually do something to help these patients?
It's a great question. There was certainly a commitment from those involved that we would do something regardless of the outcome. But there, you know, having it pass and having that push, I think, was really important. When people asked me how to vote, I said, look, vote for it. It's going to get changed, but please vote for it. But there was a commitment that something was going to happen. The question is what that will be. I mean, we're still waiting to have the next hearing on that and the special session on December 3rd.
Gallup calls Utah the second most religious state in the nation, Mississippi being the first. What role does religion play on Utah's Capitol Hill? And what role ought it to play?
People come to the Hill with their religious beliefs. Sometimes they actually even vote against them, which is really interesting. I personally don't like to see any religion pushing legislators to vote one way or the other. And we see it in a few issues. Alcohol is certainly one where you have religious input, input from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Also, you'll see some of the other religions coming up and talking to us about social justice issues. We have, you know, certain days on the Hill where the Coalition of Religious Communities comes up to talk to us about those kinds of issues. People want to listen and want to get their perspectives from those groups. But I think there's actually a public perception that there's more influence from different religious groups than there really happens to be up there.
Yes, in fact, Senator Jim DeBacchus has said that, yeah, the influence of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on Utah's Capitol Hill isn't nearly what the perception is.
Right.
Why is it, though, then, that the perception is such that the church makes one phone call and the bill disappears?
It's a good question. I don't know. I don't know why that's the perception because I haven't seen that happen. I've been there a lot, and you don't see that kind of thing happening. I mean, of course, they're not calling me, but if the word is out on some of these issues, I said probably in the alcohol field in the area, you do see that. I can remember trying to pass a bill in that area just to allow a certain pilot program. And I did get a visit from their government affairs group.
No kidding. Did you feel pressured at all by that group?
No. I explained it to them. I did not feel pressured. On the other hand, it didn't pass.
The Republicans in the Utah Legislature are enjoying a supermajority. Right now in the Senate, I believe it's 24-5, and in the House, it's 63-12. Why is there such an imbalance of power there politically, and what can be done to correct that?
Well, part of the imbalance is having to do with gerrymandering and the way the districts are cut up. Because when you divide areas and they take, the Democrats who are in a certain area and they either pack them into certain districts or they divide them to the point where they can't get elected. I mean, I can remember being on the redistricting committee and we looked at Summit County, which was the perfect number for a House seat because all House seats are supposed to have the exact same number. And lo and behold, we divided up Park City to make sure that no Democrat could get elected. And that happens a lot. Frankly, certainly the Republicans, there are a lot of Republicans in the state, and certainly they would have plenty of legislators, but redistricting makes a difference. And it doesn't help. When they're drawing lines, they should not know where any legislator, including me, nobody should know where we live. They should draw lines based on standards, based on keeping communities together. Poor little Holiday, it's divided up into so many different pieces, so many different legislators. It makes sense to have lines and have districts that are divided by people who don't have a vested interest, and that's really a lot of what's going on. Also, there are some misconceptions, I think, misunderstandings about what parties believe in and what we're talking about in terms of our proposals. Proposition
4, the ballot initiative that deals with redistricting and creating an independent commission, very, very close, and regardless of whether it passes or fails, the fact that it is so close, what message does that send from the electorate to the legislators who, by law, have to draw those districts and those boundaries?
Well, if it passes, it sends a message that we need to have some standards, because Utah is one of the few states that has hardly any standards. I mean, other than that we have to make sure they're about the same size. You may have to make sure those districts are the same size and that they're actually all contiguous and all that. We don't have standards. And so if it passes, at least you get that. I wish it passed by a huge majority. I mean, ultimately, the legislature, because of our constitutional provision, has to draw the lines. But having some input from a separate commission can only be helpful, to have some other eyes looking at it and not from the political perspective. I mean, voters should be picking legislators. Legislators should not be picking voters. And I hear stories of, oh, I wanted to get that particular neighborhood into my district because grandma was in that district, in that neighborhood. Or I wanted to keep that neighborhood out because my potential opponent is in that area. And that just shouldn't be happening. The lines should make sense and should have nothing to do with politics. If it fails, I'll be very disappointed. It was interesting as I watched the opposition who wrote the op-eds, who spoke out against it. And they mostly fell into two categories: current and former legislators.
When there is such a supermajority in the Utah Legislature, what is it that the electorate misses out on?
Well, when there's a supermajority, they can push through, without debate, bills at the very last minute and without having the public input. And so sometimes I see that happening, and that's too bad. Sometimes decisions are made behind closed doors because they've got the votes to do that. And the public misses out on the opportunity to give them input, to hear what's going on. I'll never forget one time I was kind of walking past the room where the Republican caucus was meeting in a closed caucus, and somebody came out and they said, well, we made a decision about a certain bill. I said, well, did you consider this? Did you consider that? They said, no, we really weren't allowed to bring up those issues. I think that's a sad comment. The public's business needs to be done in public.
Let me ask you a philosophical question about being a lawmaker. Did you get elected to move forward your own agenda, legitimized by the number of people who vote for you, or did you get elected to represent the opinions and the majority opinions of those who elected you?
You're assuming by that I always know what my electorate would want on every little issue, and that's hard, or even every big issue, because you don't do a poll before you vote. And you don't know on some technical securities legislation what your constituency thinks about it. But I think a couple of things. First of all, they voted for me knowing what I stand for. You try and get out there and tell them, these are the things I stand for. But when there's an issue and you hear from people, and you hear from people a lot, you need to listen. That's very important. That's why we have town meetings. That's why we are in contact with the people we represent, so that you know their views. And you learn a lot from people. I can't be an expert in everything. So it's a combination. I mean, if somebody wanted a legislator who didn't work on air quality, they probably wouldn't be voting for me because they know that's a major issue. If they wanted a legislator who didn't care about education and those issues, they wouldn't be voting for me. They'd be voting for someone else who might be having a different focus. So that you try and make sure people understand what you're about when they elect you, but you also want to listen.
Do Utah lawmakers ever come across a situation where they personally don't feel a piece of legislation ought to move forward, or they're opposed to it for some reason, but because of what they're hearing from their constituents, they actually vote in favor of that kind of piece of legislation?
I think that's happened. I mean, certainly there are situations, particularly among the there are some more moderate Republicans that represent some very conservative districts. And I think they're afraid that if they don't vote in a very conservative way, they're going to have some problems. I hear that all the time. I've heard it, saying, you know, I'm not sure I support it, but I've got to vote for it, because if not, I'll be taken out at convention or something like that.
Mm. When you look at the three propositions that were on the ballot in the midterm elections, the medical marijuana, the Medicaid expansion, and the redistricting commission, when you look at the fact that those are three major issues that came from the electorate, what message does that send in regard to how the voters feel the legislature is doing?
Well, the voters are saying the legislature is maybe not doing their job and not listening, because these are all issues that came before the legislature. We could have passed any of them. We've had bills, and we didn't. So I think, and this is not an efficient way to do this. Through an initiative process, it's expensive, it's time-consuming. You can't amend the bill as you're working on it. The voters are sending a message to the legislature, and this is the first time this has really happened, when we've had such a number of initiatives. You know, legislature, you're not listening.
Yeah, 2 out of those 3 ballot initiatives have passed. The third is very close, may or may not pass based on the counts that are going on. Ought lawmakers to kind of sit back and go, wow, maybe I'll listen a little more?
I hope so, although one of the legislators has already said he's going to try and have a bill to repeal one of them. Yeah, the Medicaid expansion. There is a senator who's announced that he announced before it passed that if it passed, he's already opened a bill file to repeal it. And that's certainly not listening.
As you look at the upcoming legislative session, what do you think is the most important issue that Utah lawmakers will deal with in the coming months?
You know, I can't answer that question because it's not one issue. There are a lot of issues. We are creating a budget that will affect the entire state, whether it's education or our infrastructure or what we're going to put into cleaning up our air. There's a whole lot of issues. And so putting together the budget is a very major issue. And how we deal with these important areas in terms of substantive legislation, we haven't seen most of the bills that are going to be heard during the January session.
One of the non-binding ballot questions that had to do with a tax increase or a gas tax increase to benefit education came and went. Were you surprised by the outcome there?
Not when I started talking to people on the doorstep. There was a lot of confusion. People said, why the gas tax to put money into public schools and higher education? In fact, they didn't even know it involved higher education. They just didn't get it. They didn't feel comfortable that the money would go there. There was this feeling like, this doesn't seem right to me. And then you had two propositions that were non-binding ballot question and a proposition both raising taxes. My concern is what was the message sent to my colleagues? Was it that we never want to raise taxes for education? Because that worries me. I think people did, but they were just concerned about the process. And again, this was a bill that came out at the very end of the session, a compromise. I think there could have been a better compromise.
Should Utah voters trust the Utah legislature more or less?
It depends on the topic. Obviously, it depends on the legislator. To say the whole group is the same is hard, but I mean, I think in general, legislators try to do the right thing. I think people are up there for good reasons and trying to help. I think they could trust the legislature a little more if there's a little more balance.
Patrice Arent, Democratic representative from House District 36. Thank you so much for being part of 3 Questions.
Thank you so much.